Well, hello everybody, and hello. I am Ursula Pottinga. I am the co-founder of Be Above Leadership, and I am here with Eric Collier, who is one of our certified neurotransformational coaches and also holds the Be Above license. And we really have wanted to put this together in order to just really shed a light on the conversation around race, and we titled it Neuroscience, Consciousness, and What Might Be an Awkward Conversation About the Racial Divide in America. And I think that it might be awkward for some of us. I think is probably one of the reasons why maybe we don't have this conversation more often, because it feels awkward. It certainly feels awkward to me. And I think this is why many people shy away from it. So I want to quickly introduce Eric beyond what he has done with our work, which includes the 7 levels of effectiveness, which is our consciousness model. Hopefully, you all have had a chance to look at the video that Anne and I have put together, a brief overview of the 7 levels. Eric was born and raised in Miami, and in his bio, he says his first job, he worked for his father on the floor cleaning, in the floor cleaning business. He got paid double the minimum wage. Good for you, good for your dad, and only was demanded excellence in return. His philosophy: be among best at whatever you do, and then you will always have work. And if you never stop learning, you will be ahead of most people. His father taught him how to build relationships that would grow and sustain a thriving business. He played sports, growing up with a fondness for baseball. And he continues to this day to play the game and also be a coach. Eric says, it trains me to be attentive to nuance and discipline in what I do. And he says, we all have talent, natural abilities that are instrumental in our success. Eric has been a coach for over 35 years. He has used the 7 levels of effectiveness as the architecture for performance enhancement in his coaching and consulting practice, as well as a roadmap for human effectiveness in all areas of his life. Welcome, Eric. It's really lovely to see you, and thank you for volunteering to be with me in this conversation. So I want to really ask you personally, as it relates to the 7 levels of effectiveness and the below the line levels of hopelessness, fear, and frustration, what takes you below the line about race and the racial divide in America?
That's how much time do we have?
Well, I have a few other questions, so I know it could be.
Well, let me tell you
talk for 3 hours just on that topic.
So, quick story. A couple of weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago today, my wife and I were on our way to. My wife is white, Caucasian, and I know you know that, but listeners might not.
Listeners might not. Yeah, exactly.
So we're driving along and approaching an intersection, and I see an Austin police cruiser approaching the intersection. Now, the cruiser's far enough away for me to get through the intersection, but it's going at speed into the intersection. And I had to make a decision whether I would risk an accident, get rear-ended, or go through the intersection, and Lord knows what would happen then.
Right.
So, I mean, this is, milliseconds or maybe nanoseconds.
Yeah.
I hit the brakes and got rear-ended.
Oh, no.
The cruiser went on through the intersection. So I felt fear in that moment, not of, and of course, fear is never about what's happening right now. It's about what might happen.
Yes.
And, so the fear was that if I went through that intersection, I would be stopped, or he would call his buddies to pull me over. So I risked an accident in doing that.
Really? Yeah.
So, you know,
So what, just sort of curiosity, what was the response of the person that rear-ended you?
Well, that was interesting in and of itself. So I drove off we were in the middle of the road, so I drove off to the side, and they eventually followed. And it turns out that it was a group of Hispanic kids. I say kids because I'm going to be 73 later this month. They were probably in their 20s.
Yeah.
30s. But anyhow, they were very apologetic. They understood exactly what happened. They saw
that.
They saw the police cruiser.
Yeah.
And my impression was they didn't say this, but just they looked a little shaken. So they probably had the same fear I had.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting that in that split second, you know, you really make a decision. And so, you know, we are, so just for, you know, transparency, and who knows, people might be looking at this video, you know, a year from now. So it's June 4th, 2020, and we are just in the middle of this crisis after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, caused by a police officer who put his knee onto his throat and killed him. And there have been riots now for days and days, and an uproar and a request for reform. So what do you think? And you were saying it's, you know, fear is often about not what's happening, you know, right now, but what is going to happen, what you're predicting, basically. Mm-hmm. So what is your experience, like maybe going back to childhood, that has sort of ingrained in you in some way fear of law enforcement?
Oh, well, I guess I'd have to start with, and this is a very vivid memory, 1953, we're in the basement of Richard's department store and we're buying school clothes. I'm going into first grade. I'm 6 years old. I wander away from my parents. I am in the elevator lobby and I see two water fountains. One on the left, stenciled colored, one on the right, stenciled white. I go over and I drink from the colored fountain, and to my amazement, it tasted like water, same water I have at home. So I knew I wasn't supposed to do this. So I looked around to see if anyone was watching, and then I drank from the white water fountain. And it, strange enough, tasted like the same water that I had. And so that was very confusing to me. And, and so I, you know, that was my first encounter with the divide. Mm. And so what it did was it gave me a sensitivity to that difference. Mm-hmm. My mother was adopted. We think she was Brazilian, and she was very light complected. My father was more like my complexion. He gets pulled over in South Miami. Now, South Miami was one of those places, and we lived south of there. It's in between the city of Miami and an area called Kendall and South Dade County. But it's one of those places where you drive through there, you drive through there and you breathe a sigh of relief when we get to the other side of the city limits in
Mm-hmm.
those days. And my father got pulled over, and the cop walked around the car multiple times, looking in, asked, of course, asked for a driver's license. And it turns out that he was concerned that my mother might have been white. So that's
that she was in danger of any kind.
Well, that crossed my mind later.
Mm-hmm.
My attention early on was only on my father's, that he was doing something he should not have been doing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, that he was at fault somehow, or that he was in trouble.
And that that I needed to be extra careful because I could get pulled over for any reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Once he figured out that my mother was not white, he let Daddy go.
It's interesting. It's now 2020, which is really there's a big difference between 1953, 1955, 1960, but from interviews on television that I have heard from people that have been peacefully protesting, it sounds like that not much has changed, that fear of, am I doing something wrong? I have to be cautious, that is still here, and that from that perspective, at least, not much has changed. Is that something that takes you below the line into maybe frustration or fear or hopelessness, or where does that take you?
Well, it's mostly frustration.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have never been a person that walked away easily.
Mm.
So, my father, I always thought that he was great at navigating situations.
Mm.
He also had an ulcer because he suppressed his frustration.
Yes.
And that always stuck in my mind that, I can't do that because that's detrimental to
your health. Yeah.
And there are occasions where I descend into hopelessness because I recognize that how deeply embedded this is in
Mm-hmm.
the psyche of the country.
Mm-hmm.
I've challenged some of my white friends and some of the other groups that I belong to look back at the Constitution and to understand how racism was baked into the Constitution and then into the amendments and laws and that have followed, and how this has been institutionalized, but not only institutionalized in terms of the way our systems work, but also how that is embedded in each of us. And so in Black people, it's, people of color, it's internalized depression, that sort of self-doubt, that what can I do about this?
Right.
And unearned privilege in white people.
Yeah.
Even Lincoln, Lincoln is pointed to as a hero, but in his own words, the Black man is not in any way equal to the white man. There's some color from Johnson as well.
Right, you're really pointing to history. And of course, when we hear these messages over hundreds of years, it's almost like people just start believing it. It's like everything else in life. If you hear it long enough, good or bad, after a while, you just believe it. And in this case, I think it's just has shifted or has sort of started a whole belief system that the whole country somehow has adopted over, decades.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about, below the line, but what takes you above the line about this, racial divide in America? Or is there anything above the line?
Well, there's always something we can do. And uh, so what I learned from my father is that uh, the world is navigable. So it's sort of like, and sometimes people get offended when I say this, but I my attitude is being black is a weather report.
Say more.
Well, if you get a weather report that says, it's going to be raining today,
you better take an umbrella.
yeah, that doesn't mean you need to get wet. It means you need to be prepared for partly county with a chance of showers. And so you can be prepared for what's out there. That's not Pollyanna. I mean, Barbara Fredrickson's done some research on neuroscientists. Y'all can look her up if you don't know what I'm talking about. That says that there's you need a 3-to-1 positive to negative emotion
reinforcement.
to live a good life, and so I don't ever want to forget that these things exist. However, that's information.
Right.
It's not like, I mean, the feelings we get as a consequence of having an emotion really are, they are information resources that can inform our thinking.
Right, and I find this interesting. So I think there is two places. There's two places to go as it relates to navigation and being prepared. You could do navigation and being prepared certainly from fear as well, of saying, oh, I need to be prepared. I need to navigate, where really the fear begins to be this almost walking on eggshells. I need to be prepared at all times, right? Which is going to be really hard on your body. That is going to be really, really, really hard to live with for long periods of time. And then there is the navigation and be prepared. It's really more about, as you said, more about courage and engagement, where you are. And so this is what I'm hearing from you, where it's information. This is what it is. Therefore, I need to be prepared, but not in a way that really compromises, your body, your system, where the stress of being prepared and navigation becomes so overwhelming. So how do you do that?
Well, interesting question. So it's back to what my father said about learning. And so, which started, by the way, with my grandmother on the sharecropper farm, when she told the landowner that her two children, would be in school and not in the fields when school was in session. If he didn't like that, they would leave. So that's my legacy. So there is knowledge is power. I can always figure out a way, and so being prepared means self-care. It means so nutrition, exercise, sleep, things that create positive emotion. And then really being intentional about how I engage in the day. So from a 7 levels point of view, my intention is to stay integrated.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm fully integrated, I'm able to use the below the line energy and information flow to inform action from above the line.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I really hear that from you, and it's interesting. We had prepared some questions just sort of to focus the conversation, but I am really seeing, one of the questions was, what is it truly to be above the line about race in America without taking what we call a spiritual bypass? That is, without just going to be, well, we are all one, and as if that handles everything. And so I think you're really speaking to that, is looking at your life and who you are, and what the world is throwing at you on a daily basis, being prepared to the eventualities, but taking action that then is, either from courage or engagement or innovation, and putting these two pieces together, where you're aware and present to what's happening, but you don't let it sort of hijack you. You don't let it, let it sort of take over.
Well, we have to, the Buddhist saying we meet 2 kinds of people in life, teachers and friends. We're real lucky we get both those in the same person any number of times. But if I take a learning stance in the day, then that relieves me of stress on several levels. First of all, I don't have to get it right.
Right.
So long as I engage, live in the question, and seek to understand, and listen from a perspective of understanding. So but it's a lot of work. The morning meditation, reviewing, readings, and then intentionally going into action. So it is a way of living. And so the standard I set for myself is that to be an effective leader, I need to be at least at level 6, with occasional visits to level 7. So what I don't expect anybody else to do that, but what if I can embody that in my approaches to playing baseball, arranging flowers, interactions
or
with
going to the grocery store.
going to the grocery store.
Right.
Then it becomes more so my brain gets primed in that way with positive emotion, and builds resilience, and I'm more likely to recover quickly, even when I hit bumps in the road. So like when that story I told you earlier, the calm came back quickly.
And it's interesting, as you're talking, I'm really aware that I think it takes a lot more effort and a lot more work for a person of color to just be in everyday life. I don't have to prepare myself in the same way. I just get up and do my thing, right? So I think there is probably an energy drain that happens to just be in normal life, because there is a different sense of preparedness that I have to have, that can add stress, huge amount of stress to people then of course that makes people even more ineffective because it has a huge impact on the brain. Now, I'm also so there's an interesting thing that you shared earlier on, from your grandmother and legacy. It sounds to me that you really were surrounded by role models from a very early age that told you that learning and education was important and showed you sort of a world of possibilities. Is that true? Do I get that right?
Oh yeah, it's in 1938, my aunt was in college because my dad it left home. He went to college for a year and wasn't for him. He became a Pullman porter, sent money home to my aunt. My grandmother only had 2 kids because she had no intention of living on that farm forever.
Right.
And her 2 kids, she developed them so that they could be off the farm, and
Yes.
they were. So that is true. My mother, God love her, my mother would ask me with every report card, didn't matter if they were all A's or whatever, are you doing your best?
Oh, wow.
So
Wow.
I can hear that
Yeah.
in my head when I feel like taking an inning off, as the saying goes.
That's really interesting, which sort of then points to how important it is right now to really help our children in schools, for them to get that message, whether it is from teachers or from parenting. It really shows me how important that is, that above the line parenting, to help children understand that it is not hopeless, but if you do your best, there is hope. It's interesting. I've sort of become a little bit addicted with the historical drama of the Medici family that has a Netflix. There's a Netflix series called the Medici the Magnificent, and there is. So one of the boys of the Medici grew up with, his mother would tell him, be good, do good. And she would tell him, in order to do good, you have to be good. Now, I think he didn't quite do that. He sort of wandered off and did some really quite horrible things, as history will tell us. But I really love that message. And I'm hearing this from you. Be good, do the best you can. That will change, and that can change a lot of things. So let's have a look at, so we've talked a little bit about the brain already, brain integration, doing, planning as well as doing and being. So let's walk the ladder briefly in regards to this topic. Just sort of taking a minute, looking at, starting in hopelessness. So if you were to walk the ladder and you would start in hopelessness, what's hopeless?
Well, that 400 years after the landing in Jamestown, here we are, and that after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one party decided to practice the politics of division as a path to victory, and they continue to do that.
Yeah.
And we're now talking about, a contested election.
Yeah.
It's unconscionable. I mean, how do we get to here?
Yeah. How did we get here? And when you look at the time that has passed, certainly even over your lifetime, I mean, really, when I look at it, it's sort of like, well, we haven't learned anything. So that there is definitely a big piece of hopelessness there. Okay, then stepping into fear, what do we need to be afraid of?
Whew. Well, we have an authoritarian on top who's, I think, a gutless wonder, but he has allies who are supporting his authoritarian tendencies, and the silence is deafening.
Wow.
From Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
And so all of that ends up, I mean, it was fear that caused me to slam on the brakes.
Yes.
So all of that is heightened now because anything can happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And that uncertainty, I think, is really, not only do we have this whole amount of uncertainty in regards to the coronavirus, but now we add that on top of everything, another piece of huge uncertainty. I am not surprised that the country, as well as the world, because it has leaked over into other countries now that have taken up, the course of that, that uncertainty is really, really a heavy, wet blanket, over the world that I think everybody can feel for sure. Okay, then stepping into frustration. What's frustrating? What's maddening?
All of the effort, all of the marches, all of the people who have given their lives, and here we are. And that just it makes, and of course frustration is a very high level of energy, so it makes you want to smash things.
Yes, and people have.
Yeah.
Of course, as you say, in regards to the 7 levels, frustration really is an out energy, that when people feel it, in their body and in the system, they want to put it somewhere, and so that outward energy, certainly got expressed, rightly or wrongly, for whatever motivation, whatever the purpose is behind it, but that is the energy of frustration. Now, frustration can also propel us into courage, which is the first level above the line. It is actually the line level for courage. So what do you see in courage as it relates to this conversation and the topic?
I see people speaking truth to power. I see, a demonstration of courage is out in the streets with people.
Yes.
With peaceful protesting. There is a more diverse group of people. In some cases, whites outnumber people of color.
Yes.
I mean, that's been pretty prominent. We're starting to hear from people like General Mattis, speaking truth to power.
Yeah.
So, and I know it's working because we can see it in the tweets. So, and in terms of moving that forward into engagement, people recognized that the track we're on. And so now the effort, for example, right here in Austin, we have turned our attention to voter registration and voter turnout. Engaging the community, and I am just amazed at the way people have stepped up to open polling places, to do virtual VDR training.
Well, it's interesting, engagement is really the description, or part of the description of the level of engagement is focusing on assets and strengths versus limitation and detriments. And I think that level of engagement is really powerful when we put our focus on what can I do? What is the strength I have? What are the possibilities? There's really, that's a huge shift from, from courage. So very briefly, innovation is level 6. You talked about that earlier on, which is setting aside personal agendas and really focusing on the most effective goal to a problem. Now, I think that putting aside your personal agenda in this scenario must be one of the hardest things that people can do, right?
Well, yes, but I think because of where we are, we need collaborators, and we need power. And the path to power is really clear. It's at the ballot box. But not only that, we must protect the electoral process because obviously the other side's more interested in being in power than they are in governing. So I think the electoral process will be under siege, already is under siege, and that will only intensify going forward. So we're all going to have to, and we're going to need allies in government, in law enforcement, across the board. And we're starting to see that happen in Santa Cruz, California, a place where I spent a lot of time early in my coaching and consulting career. You had the chief of police and the mayor taking a knee with the protesters, and people are calling for change. And there are some model policing organizations out there that have embraced neuroscience and mindfulness in their police. So that exists. But I think that what I'm seeing is an open expression of love and belonging. I don't know if you can see my T-shirt,
yes,
but
I can.
Says,
Let love have the
last word.
It's interesting. That that points me now to the level of synchronicity, which is really this open-hearted space of love and understanding, and of course, on the 7 levels, every level includes all the levels below. And so synchronicity really is this amazing space where we can really include the pain, the suffering, the anger, but also the courage and the engagement, and hold this all in this big container. And this is your T-shirt. And, as you're saying, there are already areas in the country where that is taking place. And the results are really, really different.
Yeah, and I think I've started to in the last year and a half or so, the lead line for me when I engage an organization is that organizations at their best are containers for love and belonging. If you don't love your work, if you don't love going to work, if all it is just a job, a paycheck, then there won't be much excellence around. And there'll probably be a lot of stress.
Right. And I really love this, what you're saying about belonging, because I think when we belong and our heart is in it, we also have a much higher stake in the success and the effectiveness of the organization and the system. So, if I think about law enforcement, if people within that system feel they belong, there is a belonging to community, I think then we have a different connection to our fellow brothers and sisters than when it's just like, it's a structure for, you know, a paycheck and just, you know, also potentially just as a stressor. So
Mhm.
I really love that. So I'm going to give you the last word. What advice do you have from your own background and experience? And you've already shared a lot of that. It's, you know, be excellent, you know, love what you do, you know, be prepared, navigate. But what one piece of advice would you have from your place in the world?
So, um, 7 levels. The promise of the 7 levels is to live a fully integrated life. So, you know, when things get tense, in my experience, the first thing to go is self-care.
Mm-hmm.
So, my one piece of advice is to do the things we know work in self-care. Meditation, nutrition, movement. Those are sleep. We are a sleep-deprived nation. My daughter sums it out that she's over in the UK now getting her master's in child and adolescent development. She says she's taking the 3M approach to life: meditation, movement, and make something you're proud of each day.
I mean, I really, really love that. You know, and the self-care is really, really important. I think as part of self-care is also know what to do with your emotions. You know, be present to the below the line. You know, have a trusted person in your life where you can actually either cry with or, you know, share your anger. Because I think when we neglect that part of us, that is, I think that's a recipe for disaster. I know that when I don't take care of my emotions, I then also lose sleep because I toss and turn,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, it's all cruising around in here. So, you know, I love what you're saying, and that the 3M, you know, is really part of that, you know, meditation, which is mindfulness. And mindfulness is about be present to how you feel and express it somehow, you know, in a way that's respectful and doesn't hurt anybody. So really, really love that.
Well, bottom line, the 7 levels gives us a way of understanding what's happening inside this system,
Yes.
and then acting upon it, acting with being informed by that
Yes.
information.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Eric, thank you. I could go on as well for, you know, for hours talking to you. It's always just great. We so appreciate your contribution, and we really hope that your advice and your stories, you know, serve, which I'm very sure, I'm absolutely sure they will. So again, thank you very much,
Okay.
for everything.